Hello everyone, I'm Prem Sinha, Editor-in-Chief of Ramjas Political Review. For the very first episode of RPR Global Village, we have with us Mr. Shivshankar Menon, India's former Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor. Mr. Menon, the Agnipath scheme brought up some really interesting issues in the context of India-Nepal relationship that could add China to a position of advantage. Kathmandu had expressed its disapproval about the scheme when the Nepali soldiers and most of them being the Gurkhas would retire after 3.5-year tenure, they wouldn't be receiving any pension nor they would be able to benefit from any other sort from other sorts of government of India jobs. What in that case would stop the retired soldiers with proper military training from joining the Maoist insurgency groups? What's your take on this, sir?
Well, there's been, I think firstly we need to separate two things.
Right.
One is doing the Agniveer scheme and how it affects our relationship with Nepal is one issue. Whether China benefits or not, whether the Maoists get recruits or not, these are second order effects and further down the road.
Right.
I think the immediate problem is that employment, under Nepalese law, Nepalese can work as soldiers only for the Indian Army and the British Army. But the fact is that with Agniveer, this traditional means of employment, which supports a huge number of Nepalese families. In fact, if you look at the number of Nepali citizens who are supported by pensions, military pensions, etc., from India, it's over 2 million people who are dependent on this in Nepal. So once you introduce the Agniveer scheme, and many of them then get phased out, not all, but many of them get phased out without a pension within a few years, obviously it affects their prospects in life. Your basic point that, these people will be armed and trained with nowhere to go, that applies even more to the Indians who go through that scheme. I mean, where do they go? Now whether they choose to join Maoists or Naxalites or whether they take to criminality or what, that's a completely different issue. But you're right, there is a social issue there for Nepal, for India. But for Nepal, I think you see some of the effects already. Recruitment of Nepalese over the last 2 years actually has now gone way down into the Indian Army. There at least 10 Nepalese have been killed fighting for the Russians in Ukraine, which is illegal under Nepalese law. So I think there is a problem here with the scheme and its effect on India-Nepal relations. In the long run, it affects, the pool of friends that you have in Nepal, because many of these people who have worked in India, lived in India, worked with Indians, depend on Indian government pension, they are a pool of friends in your neighborhood who are important from your point of view, because you need a peaceful periphery. So I think for you, we need to look at this primarily as us. Whether it benefits China, how China uses it, is another issue. And China is interested in Nepal anyway, and will be in Nepal anyway, irrespective of how you sort out the Agniveer issue, which the two governments have said they are discussing and trying to find a solution for, but they have not so far done so over a year and a half. So it's hard to see how they can find a solution without carving out an exception for the Nepalese, which then many Indians also want the same exception for themselves. So it's going to be a complicated problem to try and solve. But you're absolutely right in that it does have the potential, and in fact already has, I think, had some deleterious effects on our relationship with Nepal.
Right, sir. Sir, although you said that we shouldn't care about how China would be reacting or gaining from our policies of from the Agnipath scheme, but yet I would want to ask, what in that case? With China's eagerness to recruit the Gurkhas in the PLA, what does it mean for India?
There's no proof of Chinese eagerness to recruit Gurkhas in the PLA, by the way.
There were a few reports that were coming.
There are stories.
Okay.
There are stories, but I have seen absolutely no proof of that.
Okay.
In fact, there is no proof of the Chinese recruiting any foreigners. In fact, it's the other way around. The Chinese are exporting their private security companies and former PLA people for security duties abroad. So they are doing what other great powers have done. You know, what US contractors and what, say, Wagner Group in Russia and so on have been doing. Because the PLA has a very unique military culture of its own, and they're not going to dilute that. The PLA is primarily an instrument of the party. No, the reason I am saying that you need to first think about your interest. Your interest is not, how do I do China down? If that is your definition of your interest, you will end up purely reactive. But India has much bigger interests than that. Your job is not to counter China. Your job is to make India, to transform India into a modern, prosperous, secure country where every citizen can achieve their potential. That's your job. So you have a much bigger interest. Countering China is hardly your interest. That's not the point. Where China crosses your interest, yes, you will counter. But there are places where she doesn't. But I don't think you should look at, especially with your neighbors, if you start looking at your relationship with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka as, oh, China's there and therefore I must counter China. Frankly, you are throwing out the baby with the bathwater, one, because you are no longer pursuing your interests. Two, you are giving your smaller neighbors an agency and a control of that relationship, which you should be having, because they will play you against each other. And three, you are then giving China the driving seat in the relationship, because your only job is countering them, is reacting to them. So this doesn't make sense to me as a way of looking at your neighborhood or even at the world. For me, chase India's interest. And that is what you should be doing. Where China's interest goes against yours, oppose it. Do what you can. China builds a road through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, oppose it, of course. Do whatever you can. But that's not, I think, your function in life. That shouldn't be your goal in life, and that shouldn't be especially how you look at your close neighbors.
Right, sir. Sir, on the same note, I would want to add I would want to see clarity on another hypothesis that I was thinking about last night. I mean, how appropriate do you think this is that if a country has prior friendly relations with India and is trying to establish amicable bonds with China, the decision is not in favor of India. To put it clearly, if a small nation state in the Indian Ocean wants to pursue friendly relations with China while not disrupting its prior relations with India, should India try to talk them through it, like what's happening in Maldives?
You're making the same mistake.
Yeah.
You're assuming that our relationship with somebody depends on their relationship with China.
Right.
Does your relationship with Russia depend on your relationship with the US? Are you willing to, is that how you want to be treated by both of them?
No, sir.
No. You're buying Russian oil despite US sanctions on Russia, and the US is your biggest trading partner. You're still working with them. So this is why I keep saying it's not your job. Your job is to further India's interests.
Right.
There may be places where countering China serves India's interests, but there will also be places where it doesn't. And especially with the neighbors, you have much bigger interests with your neighbors. You should be looking after India's security, India's prosperity. We have a fundamental interest in a peaceful periphery. So go out and work for it. And after all, your basic interest here coincides with that of your neighbors. They also want prosperity and security. If you are a net provider of security in the neighborhood, if you are the main source of their prosperity, which in Nepal's case, there is no comparison between what Nepal does economically with China and what she does with India, then you must be therefore in their mind as the main provider of stability and the guarantee of a future.
Right.
If you can do that, then what they choose to do with third countries is their business. They are sovereign states, don't forget. Just like you jealously guard your sovereignty.
Absolutely.
They will do the same. And you must give them the right to do so. But make yourself a better partner. And make sure that in your neighborhood, where you have huge advantages of language, of all kinds of affinity, you name it, and of access, of population, cross-border ethnicities. All these are advantages that you should be using. Use them. Cultural affinities, you name it. Every one of those things works in your favor. Geography, history, they work in your favor. Use them. But go out there and pursue your interest. And stop looking at the world the way the Chinese would like you to do. The Chinese would like you to think this is China's world and everything depends on China.
Definitely. So, a recent article on the Indian Express reads the Indian Council Secretariat is in the process of bringing in a national security strategy. Of course, there is no official notice about it, but we have seen a vocal stand for the same. There are criticisms in the United States for the NSS that A, it is not actually a strategy, which is a guide for choosing among options, but a list of objectives and deadlines for the bureaucrats. Strategy, by definition, says that some things are more important than the others, and not all nice things go together. And B, strategy documents overgeneralize. What do you think of these criticisms of NSS?
Well, any public document on a sensitive issue, like a national security strategy, will have its limitations in what it can say in public and what it can't, right? So the purpose of a national security strategy document issued by a government is threefold. One is it establishes the priorities across government, and secondly, it communicates to the public what the government considers important and what it can do. But it will omit a level of detail that a real strategy contains, which is why a national security strategy is then followed by a whole series of confidential or secret documents, a national defense strategy, a national foreign policy strategy. Each hierarchy will then work out within those priorities what it has to do. Now, the third problem with a strategy, third issue with any strategy, is that ultimately it has to come up against events, against the reality. Nobody can predict the future,
Right.
just like any strategy can't. So it will have to be a generalization. It will have to be broad enough to cope with foreseeable contingencies, but it will have to make it will have to be based on a set of assumptions about the future. And how do you make assumptions? You make scenarios and you ascribe probability to them. Which ones are likely to happen, which are more likely, which are less likely. These don't stay the same. 2 years from now, you might change your probability of likelihood of that happening, right? So once you do that, within that process, it's a dynamic process. But the strategy, when you issue it every 5 years, 4 years in the US case, because that's what the term of an administration. In our case, I presume it would be 5 if we do one.
Right.
It'll then, you'll revise it as you go along. So you can't expect it to be an accurate, detailed strategy in public of everything, because if you did that, all your adversaries would know exactly what you're doing, and they would counter it very effectively.
Absolutely.
So there's a point beyond which you cannot make a public document which meets your academically rigorous definition of a strategy. Last issue actually with a strategy is an ends and means problem.
Okay.
And it has to fit your means. It cannot be, you can't make a strategy for all the wonderful things you would like, but if you don't have the means or the capability to achieve those, right? So it will evolve, because each of the three elements, what are the elements of a strategy? You have goals, which is your national interest. You then have a set of means to achieve those goals, right? The ends and means. But you're achieving them in a situation. Situations change very fast. You would never, 3 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted Ukraine war or what's happening in Gaza, right? Means change, but change slowly. It takes time to build national strength, economic strength, or military strength, hard power in any way. The goal takes a very long time to change. Our goal has been consistent since independence. That's 75 plus years, right? The transformation of India. And how do you create an enabling environment for the transformation of India? Which in our case means we need the peace, we need the engagement abroad, we need to protect India so that we can transform India for its people. So these elements, there is only so much you can say in public in a national security strategy. So far, we have tried 3 times actually in the past to write national security strategies and have produced documents, including the former NSAB had done so. But so far, no government has actually seen its way to publishing it. Even as a draft saying, okay, what do people think? Let's hear what the public thinks about it. Or as a general indication.
Is there any
And,
particular reason for? Sorry for to interrupt.
well, I think there's 3 reasons. I mean, but most obvious is what Robert Gates, who used to be the US Defense Secretary, former head of the CIA, the ultimate insider in the US system, he once said that, you know, we spend a great deal of time and effort doing a national security strategy. And it's a very useful exercise because it clarifies our mind. But never in all my years in government, when there's an actual crisis or a decision to be made, do I turn to the national security strategy.
Right.
So in a sense, it performs an educative function. It indicates priorities. It sets you thinking in a certain way. When the US national security strategy switches from a global war on terror to saying the main issue today is great power rivalry, then the rest will follow. Who's the great power that they are rivaling? China. So it's Russia. It becomes, so policy shifts. And then everybody shifts from counterterrorism to how do we counter, how do we deter, how do we dissuade. And so to that extent, it's a useful exercise, but we mustn't overestimate its function.
Okay. Mr. Menon, you talked about the NSS. Of course, that story in the Indian Express, there is no official statement or any evidence behind if we are still working on it. Do you think how far are we from an NSS?
I really don't know, because there have been, as I said, 3 attempts before. There were complete drafts of an NSS, but it's a political call about whether they want to issue it or not and how they want to issue it. As a full-fledged strategy or just as a draft with 4 public comments. There's various ways of putting it out.
Right, right. I mean, what do you think about India should have in mind about the Belt and Road Initiative? With around 150 states benefiting from the Chinese investment, why would any Southeast Asian country want to side with India on any polarizing public issue, not on things that would have only India's interest in mind? What if there is any polarizing issue where they have to choose between India and China? Why would they side with India if China is investing in their infrastructure?
You know, I don't think it's a question of do you side with India or they will side with their own interest.
Okay.
They will side with, if they see Belt and Road giving them something that they need, that is useful to them, they will take it. We have particular reasons not to join the Belt and Road, not to go to the forum, because there's no Belt and Road agreement that you sign to join.
Right.
That's just an invitation to a meeting, and you've had the 3rd Belt and Road Forum this year. And we didn't attend the first 2 times when we were invited. 3rd time, we haven't been invited as far as I know. But I think we have particular reasons which are unique to us. The Belt and Road, the largest single flagship project actually of the Belt and Road is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And that runs through Indian territory, which has been occupied by Pakistan. So there's no reason for us, therefore, to look at this kindly, because it creates a Chinese stake in the status quo, which from our point of view is unacceptable. This is Indian territory under Pakistani occupation. And we don't see why China should be actually buttressing Pakistani occupation of our territory. So for us to oppose that makes sense. That doesn't mean, I think, in practice, if you look at it, there are Belt and Road projects which make economic sense and which are open to others, which you can use. Because after all, these are the sovereign property of the countries concerned. Colombo Port, for instance.
Right.
The expansion of Colombo Port has taken place in phases under Belt and Road projects. And yet, or over 80% of what goes through that port is to or from India.
Right.
And so, in a sense, you get the use of it. Now, I don't see that we should object to China putting in the money, the effort, building infrastructure, which we can use.
Right.
I mean, that's
Absolutely.
not,
Absolutely.
I think, our objection. Our objection is clear, is to, now there are other parts of the Belt and Road practices which we have publicly in the past raised. We've pointed out that many of the countries who receive these Chinese funds are in no position to pay it back. And I think we've been proved right by experience. If you look at the $1 trillion or so that China has spent on Belt and Road, today, not just Sri Lanka, which defaulted last year, but something like another at least 26 countries are having trouble repaying Belt and Road loans.
Do you also
And
think that it's a
China herself has cut down on how much money she is putting into Belt and Road projects, new projects, and the whole scale of Belt and Road is being redefined, and I think she's putting in much more financial control. We'll have to see how it evolves. So my attitude would be, that to the extent that Belt and Road is commercially viable, make projects which are usable by everybody, and serves an economic, is open, good, we'll use it. I mean, it's a net addition to the public. But where it affects your interests negatively, or where it creates dependencies and so on, which countries then cannot get out of, that becomes a problem. And that, I think, we rightly have pointed out to people. But there is one thing there. You know, when you tell somebody that, oh, you're going into a debt trap, when they're doing it quite willingly and of their own, it's not the best diplomacy. Because it amounts to telling somebody that, look, you're a fool. I know better than you. And nobody likes being told that.
Absolutely.
So how you go about this has to be, it has to be, you have to do this a little carefully.
Right.
And you make your views known, but you do it in a way that people can take on board and doesn't provoke resentment.
Right. Sir, all of us know that how the sun never set on the British Empire, and just within a few decades, the territories gained through centuries were lost in the 20th century. Empires fall. A few weeks ago in London, Dr. Jashankar said that the United States isn't in decline. It is in the process of reinventing itself. Do you think that the External Affairs Minister would have said the same if he weren't holding the office? Because several scholars believe that the USA is on a verge of decline due to how white collar jobs are not secure, the cities are not safe anymore, the schools are falling, etc., and that China shall be the next USA. What is your idea of this situation?
Well, this first question is, cities unsafe,
Right.
white collar jobs not safe anymore. Do you think 1870s, 1880s, 1890s US was very safe with the Wild West, with New York the way it was? And yet that is exactly when the US rose to become the world's biggest economy.
Okay.
Right? In exactly that period. So I don't think you should draw conclusions from internal situations to how a country's role and stature abroad follows. I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. When it starts weakening it, yes. But in the US, much of that originally was actually a sign of a society in turmoil and change, reinventing itself. In my lifetime, I have heard the US written off 5 times as finished. It's declined, it's over.
When were those
And I
situations?
heard this.
When
I
did
heard
those?
this in the 60s,
Okay.
when there were civil rights, Vietnam War, students were being shot on campus in Kent State. A president was assassinated. Presidential candidates were assassinated,
Right.
Robert Kennedy. And there was turmoil. But the US bounced back. 75, when after the fall of Saigon, Vietnam, everyone said the US is finished. She's going home. You can't count on the US. What happened? Same thing when Reagan came to power. And same thing when dot-com crash. Now, again, you heard after 9/11, that's the end of it.
Right.
If you look at the US share of world GDP, since 1980, it's been roughly constant. It fluctuates between 25 and 30%. That's more than a quarter of the world's GDP is the US. In terms of military power, she is still the only superpower militarily. She's the only one who can project military power across the world when she wants, where she wants. Nobody else. Not China, not Russia, right? In terms of technology, there is no match to the US. China might register more patents, but she imports more IPs, 6 times more IPs than she exports. So she's a net importer of knowledge. The US is still the primary source of innovation and basic technologies. Not applications, but basic technologies. So for me, when he says the US actually, if you look at its record in the last century, it's quite remarkable how it has consistently reinvented itself because it's a society in constant change. Now, change means also turmoil, also means social tension. I mean, this is a country which didn't give blacks the vote until the 1960s, where women are still fighting for some rights, including their reproductive rights. But this is part of a society that is in constant change and reinvention. And it's a society where power is distributed, where it doesn't matter what president you have. We've survived one Trump, we might have to survive another. But, you know, it's had an Andrew Jackson in power and it was still rising. It's gone through all, because power is distributed. It was designed for this kind of failure. If one part of the system fails, the other part works. So I think what the EM said in London actually makes sense, both in terms of the US capacity to reinvent themselves. Do we think they'll manage to do it again? What they have done successfully so far, and this is a different issue from US predominance or power, is they have prevented the emergence of a peer competitor. They saw off the Soviet Union, who was probably the most, they offered a completely alternative system and way of running life. But they also saw off, well, Germany, of course, but they also saw off Japan in the 80s, when it looked like Japan was going to overtake them. China, we don't know. Did China make her move too soon, reveal her ambition? It could be. Today's conventional wisdom is China will never overtake the US in terms of per capita income. Who knows? I mean, you know, that's a straight line extrapolation from today's trends. But straight line extrapolations 10 years ago said, oh, China's going to overtake the US in every respect. Let's see. We don't know what the future holds. But the US certainly has demonstrated the capability, whether she will reinvent again, whether she'll see off another peer competitor, I don't know. I think she'll reinvent herself. But whether she can see off such a formidable peer competitor as China, I don't know. Today, if you look at it, it looks like she will, because everybody else is also scared by the rise of China, and is therefore, for the US, has found it possible to do things like AUKUS, the Quad, to find partners to actually help her in her work. That's an interesting problem, but and nobody can say with certainty. But I would say that the odds are stacked today in her favor. 2 years from now, if you ask me, maybe I'll say no. I don't know. But we'll have to see. For me, that's the big question of our times.
Definitely, sir. Sir, a few years ago, you had said that there are 5 types of Pakistan: the civil society, the Pakistani business community, the civilian politicians, the Pakistani military, and the jihadi elements, where you said that diplomacy and military alone cannot work. Can you please elaborate on this aspect? How do you think one should approach this issue if diplomacy and military alone cannot figure out a solution to it?
Well, 2 of the 5 are structurally inimical to India, right? Hostile.
Right.
the Pak army for its own institutional interest. It needs an enemy. It needs India as an enemy to justify its control of Pakistan, Pakistani politics, the economy, budget, etc. The jihadi tanzeems for ideological reasons, and because that's their existence. I mean, they see their function as being to do down a secular state like India. But the other three elements, frankly, do not have the same approach to India. In fact, they're more open within a certain range, but certainly they're much more open to working with India, and they're not structurally inimical to India the way these two are. So it seems to me you therefore have to follow a policy of making sure that minimum that the other three are not pushed into the arms of the first two, of your enemies, one. Secondly, and if you can keep them neutral, I mean, that in itself is enough. Secondly, you should actually be cultivating those elements in Pakistan which mean you no harm and which could actually potentially be dependent on the relationship with India. I mean, whether it's business or whether it's... And in the civil society, certainly there are elements which are favorable, which see common culture, common language, etc. So for me, therefore, I think it's a mistake to keep talking of Pakistan as though there's one Pakistan. Pakistan is a brand new state, which is still in the process of becoming a Westphalian state. Its borders are not hard. The monopoly of violence certainly doesn't exist with the state. So it's within itself, there is no settled constitutional order. So if you look at all the characteristics of a nation state in the Westphalian sense, I mean, Pakistan fails on all counts, which is one reason why they're in such a mess today. Because they think they're a Westphalian state. So I don't think you should deal with them as a Westphalian state. You should deal with them, and you will follow contradictory policies. To some elements of Pakistan, I think you'll be soft, gentle, friendly. Towards other elements, you should be hard. Military means will work. Yes, up to a point. But ultimately, you need to use a combination of all the elements of state power, whether it's economic, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's military, everything covert, whether it's mind games. I mean, all of them. You need to use everything possible and use them in different doses depending on which Pakistan you're dealing with. And that, for me, it's not that you will ever solve your Pakistan problem, but it can certainly change the nature of that problem, mutate it from being a really malign problem for you into something a little more benign.
Absolutely. Sir, how do you think the future of Pakistan would look like? How do you see it?
I don't see Pakistan going away. I mean, it's the same opposite problem like the US decline. How long have you heard that Pakistan's a failed state or failing state? It's been failed for the last 30 years. It's
Even
not
Pandit
going
Nehru
anywhere.
had said that it would not exist after a few years when the partition
won't
was taking
exist.
place.
It's going to be there, and it's there. And one reason it exists is because, frankly, the neighbors need it to exist.
Right.
I mean, if Pakistan crumbled tomorrow, vanished, Afghanistan would become a Pathan majority state, Pashtun majority state. Everybody else in Afghanistan would then feel terribly threatened.
Absolutely. The British did a
If
huge
Pakistan
mess
came back to India, what would it do to your communal balance?
Right.
I mean,
They're highly
if you look at
radicalized
it,
people.
Akhand Bharat is 40% Muslim. And so you need to think twice. For the Iranians, if Pakistan vanishes, Sistan, Balochistan, and Sistan, which is really the same, the Baloch, become a huge element and an indigestible element of Iran. So in many ways, this idea that, Pakistan's failed, it's vanishing, it's going, I'm not so sure.
Absolutely. Sir, I'm opening the floor for the members of Ramjas Political Review. If they have any question, they can ask you. Arya, Piyush, Siddhant, Neera, feel free to ask any question.
Good evening, sir. I wanted to
Good
ask
evening.
that is yes, I wanted to ask, should morality and national interest be treated as opposites? And how do we maintain an equilibrium between them while framing our policies and taking our actions?
They cannot be separated. And this, every Indian theorist from the beginning, from Kautilya onwards, will tell you that the purpose of political power is dharma. And you cannot separate morality from interest, from national interest. It might be a different sort of morality, you might define it differently, but you have to. Why do you need some form of morality? Because sheer power on its own is not enough, is never enough to achieve what the state wants to do, which is to have control and peace. The state also needs the consent or the acquiescence of the people. And this is the whole problem with conquering foreign territories and so on. And how do you get that acquiescence? How do you get legitimacy, in other words? You can either do it ideologically or you can do it through charisma, through personality, and so on, or you can do it institutionally, which is the way the Westphalian state normally does it. In order to get legitimacy, you have to be able to show people that you have a right, a moral right to be there. You can either claim divine right of kings or claim some religious sanction if you're a religious state. But in most cases, you would say it's the people's consent. So there is an ethics which is, it's a different dharma from, you would say, personal dharma. But there is an ethics that is essential for the legitimacy of power and for power to work. So there is a practical reason for ethics and morality in politics and in statecraft, which is essential. I mean, this is why states go to such extents to try and justify what they are doing and use the language. Why you hear politicians using the language of morality? Because people are very uncomfortable with the thought that, oh, well, I'm just being ruled because of coercive power of the state. This is not something that people take to very easily. So for me, it's more than just the authority of the state depends on a certain form of legitimacy which it has to create through ethical behavior, or at least by finding ethical justifications for its behavior. So I don't think you can just separate national interest from morality. But it is a different morality. It is a larger calculation. There are elements of, when you look at ethical calculations in statecraft, for instance, is it worth, we all say every human life is precious, right? But do you choose, in order to save 100 people, you choose to lose 2? I mean, statecraft poses problems like that, ethical problems.
The classic
If
ethical
you have
problem.
only limited resources to save people from a flood, where do you go? Do you go to the larger numbers? What do? Do you say, I'll save the old, not the young? I mean, how do you... These are problems that statecraft poses. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to say that I made the ethical choice. Maybe a different set of ethics, but it is an ethical choice. So I don't believe that you can have a purely amoral statecraft. And even people keep saying Kautilya, ultimate realist, amoral. I don't think so. If you actually read it, what is Yoga Kshema, which is the ultimate goal of the state? It's the welfare of the people. And why does he keep saying you have to function for the welfare of the people? Because he wants legitimacy for his authority, for all the things the state is forced to do.
Definitely. Piyush, do you want to ask any question? Piyush and Arya?
That's a great question, by the way.
Yeah, that was a really nice
You have a
question.
PhD thesis at least there.
Thank you so much, sir.
Sir, I have another question on a side note that I remember asking you a few months ago at India International Center. Sir, do you think with the sheer rise in the number of think tanks in the global arena, do you think that the Indian Foreign Services is still a viable career option for the students who are interested in it? in
It's a
international
great career
diplomacy?
option. I mean, from my experience, I'd say it's a wonderful career option.
Okay.
I still think it's a great career option because, no matter what, I mean, unless you are academically inclined, if you have any interest in practicing what you preach, in testing your theory in the real world, there's nothing like the Foreign Service.
Right.
I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? So for me, it's a great career, but I would qualify it with two things. You need to enjoy change, and because every 3 years you're in a new place, different people. You also need to enjoy working with people, because ultimately diplomacy is a people business. It's something that you do with other people, and you need to enjoy that. So if you're an introvert who is not comfortable shifting, changing, and because that's not easy, and it gets harder as you get older, then I'd say it's not the career for you. Then if you're interested in foreign affairs, go and be an analyst, be an academic, work for a think tank maybe. But for anybody else who likes change, likes people, likes going out and seeing different things and learning right through the career, I'd say it's an ideal career.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your words, sir. The conversation that we had was a really insightful. It was a really insightful experience for all of us. We look forward to having more such engaging conversations with you in the future, hopefully in person. That's how we will be ending the meeting today. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.